Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retroid Gamecore. The Anbernic RG477M is now out for sale, and so today what I want to do, in addition to the review video I did earlier this week, is a comparison video against probably its biggest competitor. We're going to compare it to the Retroid Pocket 5, which retails for $20 less, and we're going to throw in a couple additions because these two devices, the Retroid Pocket Flip 2 and the Mini version 2, have the same chipset, and so it just kind of all lumps together with these three. So my goal in this video is to go through all the stuff that's the same and different between them in case you are looking for a mid-tier handheld around the $250 price point. And long story short, I think that all four of these are excellent handhelds. It really comes down to which one is going to be the best fit for your needs. And so that's what we're going to focus on in this video. Grab your favorite snack and drink. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, I'm going to start by saying that I'm not going to do a deep dive review of every single component in every single one of these devices, otherwise we will be here for like 3 hours. Now, I'm sure you'd love to see a 3-hour of me rambling about handhelds, but we're going to try to keep this as tight as possible. So in the video description below, I'll link to all my in-depth reviews of each of these handhelds, and then if you need any additional information about any of them, you can find that there. And let's start with a quick recap of what each of these devices are. The Anbernic RG477M, which is the focal point of this video, comes out today, and it is a metal handheld with a 4:3 aspect ratio. They're offering two different models here. They have an 8GB RAM and 128GB storage model, and then also one with 12GB of RAM and double that storage. There's a $50 difference between the two, and honestly, I don't think you need more than 8GB of storage when it comes to all the stuff you're going to play on this device anyway. So my recommendation is the 8GB model will probably be a better fit all around. So as we go through this video, I'm going to focus on that 8GB model because that's the one I recommend, and the starting price for that is $240 retail before shipping. Now, if you're catching this video right in the beginning, then it will be on sale for the first few days down to $220, but I'm going to focus on $240 as our retail value. A couple other notes, this metal handheld comes in two different colors. There's a silver version and a bronze version. I have the silver one, but I think that the bronze one looks a little bit better. And then finally, Anbernic is also unique compared to Retroid in that they offer additional microSD cards with your purchase. These cards are going to be preloaded with ROMs that will be pre-configured to work with the emulators already installed on the device. Now, personally, I prefer to install my own emulators and use my own ROMs, but if you're just trying to get something preloaded, then your only option between the two is going to be the Anbernic model. Now, the Retroid Pocket 5 has been out for a while now, and it costs $220 before shipping. Now, one of the cool things about this one is that it comes in 4 different color options. We've got some pretty good choices here. And same thing with the Retroid Pocket Flip 2. This one's got 4 different color options, and the Snapdragon 865 model of this one, which is the same chip as the Retroid Pocket 5, costs $230. So this one is $10 cheaper than the RG477M. And then finally, we've got the Retroid Pocket Mini version 2. This one only has one color. It only comes in black, and this one cost $199 before shipping. In general, I prefer the additional color options we have with the Retroid devices, and also they have a DIY section on their website where you can customize it even further. They sell things like additional back plates and buttons and D-pads and sticks, so you can get all this stuff for a pretty fair price if you want to customize it as well. So if you are looking for something with, some flashy colors or additional options in terms of customization, the Retroid is going to be better in that regard. If you're looking for something that's preloaded where you can pay a little bit extra to get an SD card with ROMs on it, then you can go through Anbernic for that as well, but I do recommend just using your own. So beyond the price and the colors, what other things do we have with these handhelds? Let's talk about the chip and this screen. The Anbernic has the Dimensity 8300, which is the strongest chip among the others, and all the other ones have the Snapdragon 865, which is an older processor but has very nice compatibility. The 3 Retroid devices all have OLED panels, whereas the Anbernic is LCD. This one is a 4.7-inch display, 4:3 aspect ratio, with a resolution of 1280 by 960. That resolution is going to be a really good fit for most retro games, and then also the 120Hz refresh rate will also be really helpful here too. The Retroid Pocket 5 and the Flip 2 have the exact same screen, so they are OLED, 1920 by 1080 resolution, and they are 16:9 aspect ratio. They have a standard 60Hz refresh rate like the Retroid Pocket Mini, but obviously the Mini is a different size and shape. This one is 3.92 inches with a resolution of 1240 by 1080 and an aspect ratio of 31 by 29, so it's relatively squarish. Other than that, the overall user experience is going to be pretty similar between all of these. They're all Android based, which essentially means that they kind of work like a tablet or a phone. You're going to install all your emulators, you're going to load up your ROMs, and then use a front end to kind of cover everything up. Now, in terms of size and weight, there's obviously a lot of variance here. This one's made out of metal, these are all made out of plastic, and so on. And one of the big factors here is going to be the screen and its dimensions. Like the Retroid Pocket 5, this is 5.5 inches, which makes it a wider device. Same thing with the Retroid Pocket Mini with its more squarish aspect ratio, it makes it less wide than the RG477M. The Retroid Pocket Flip is kind of in a class of its own because it is a clamshell, which means that, yeah, it gets really small when you close it up, but it gets nice and big when you open it up as well. And as you can see, yeah, same screen here between the Retroid Pocket 5, just in a different form factor. And the weight is obviously going to be different too, so 363 grams for this metal one. This thing is quite chunky. The next heaviest would be the Retroid Pocket Flip 2 at 308 grams. Then it would be the Retroid Pocket 5 at 272. And then finally, the RP Mini is much smaller and, of course, a lot lighter. Among all of them, the only one I really classify as being pocketable is the Retroid Pocket Mini. This is one that I will actually put in my pocket and use. The other ones will fit in your pocket, but I find them to be a little bit too unwieldy, and so instead I prefer to chuck those in a bag. Now, in terms of the button placement and overall design, you can see that they are pretty similar between these three in that they are all D-pad centric. That means the D-pad is up top, then you have your face button, then your analog sticks down below. There are some other critical differences though. For example, the Anbernic has inline shoulder buttons, which means this is R1, this is R2, and so on, whereas these other ones all have stacked shoulder buttons. So it's a little bit more of a traditional layout where you have your shoulders and then your triggers. And this will definitely come into play depending on the type of games you plan on playing. For example, more modern games will obviously use this kind of control scheme, but when it comes to more retro games where you maybe only had shoulder buttons, if that, then there's not a huge difference between the two. The button layout on the Retroid Pocket Flip 2 is even more unique because it has the D-pad and face buttons down below. Now, this is actually surprisingly comfortable to use, and the analog sticks are up above, which makes them actually very comfortable with a more modern game, just because the sticks and the triggers and everything are right here. And so I actually prefer to do like things like streaming or modern games on this one over the others. Now, the D-pad on the Retroid devices is all the same. It's a PS Vita style D-pad and has a dome switch connection, which means it's really soft and clicky and very precise. The Anbernic, on the other hand, has a rubber membrane connection, kind of like your traditional Nintendo or Super Nintendo controller, so this one has a lot more bounce back to it and is relatively silent. It's worth noting that all these D-pads are actually very, very good, very precise, and I love playing with all of them, but I will say the Anbernic has a more classic feel, so if you're playing retro games in particular, then this one seems to be a more fitting example compared to these ones, which have a more modern feel. Now, the analog sticks on all these devices are also very good and very similar. So they're all Hall sensor sticks, which means they're going to be less prone to stick drift, and they have a nice wide range of motion. The overall feel and accuracy between all of them is almost identical. The only major difference would be that the Anbernic ones stick out a little bit more than the others because these caps are a little bit taller. However, the nice thing about these sticks is that the caps are removable, and so you can make them shorter and taller if you would like. I've talked about these sticks a lot recently because I got a bunch of them in for testing, and there are a bunch of shops like it, but they basically create these 3D printed stick caps that will work on all of these devices, and you can get low profile ones, high profile ones, and so on. So for example, these ones are taller and a little bit wider. So if you are playing in an environment where you don't really care about pocketability or portability, but you want to have the most control possible, then you can use these sticks to enhance the overall control and feel. It's going to be a really good fit with stuff like the Retroid Pocket 5 because with this 16:9 aspect ratio, I feel like it's a better fit for more modern games where you are going to be playing something that's very analog stick centric. And so, yeah, I think that this is worth it in terms of portability, especially if you're going to be playing something more modern. And the great thing is you can just swap these out at any time depending on what game you're playing, and you just kind of have to keep track of them. The other side of the coin is that there are low profile sticks as well. And so you can put these on something like the RG477M and make this device even slimmer and sleeker. So for example, with these low profile sticks from that same Hypesticks place, they are 22.33 millimeters with the standard sticks that come with the device, but then these low profile sticks are about 1 millimeter thinner, which is pretty great. By contrast, the Retroid Pocket 5 with its standard sticks and its more ergonomic grips, it's about 27 millimeters instead. It's also worth noting that all the joysticks here have RGB lighting that you can customize within these software settings as well. I've got them turned on some and turned off on the others, but yes, this is something you can do. So when it comes down to it, I think that both of these devices are well suited for retro gaming in particular because they are D-pad centric and they are very comfortable to use. All the controls are excellent and very precise. But if you're looking to play more modern games, then something like the Retroid Pocket 5 is a better fit. It's got that 16:9 aspect ratio as well as those stacked shoulders and triggers. The Anbernic feels like it's more focused on being really thin and streamlined because we have these inline shoulders and triggers, which again are going to be fine for playing retro games, but not so great when it comes to playing like modern shooters. Now for all these devices, the face buttons are rubber membrane, including these that have the dome switch D-pad. And the buttons all work well, I've got no major issue with their actual functionality, but one issue I do have with the Retroid models is that the buttons are quite loud and clacky. Let me give you a sound comparison between these and the relatively silent ones from Anbernic. Another major factor with these devices is just the feel of playing them, and they are quite different on their own. Like I mentioned before, the Anbernic has a metal shell to it, so it's very hefty and kind of squarish along the edges as well. It's got a flat back to it, and so it does feel like playing like a slab, and this can be a good or a bad thing. I think that it feels a little bit more retro. It kind of reminds me of, holding an old NES controller that's been made in a modern age. When you combine that with the rubber membrane D-pad and face buttons, it just has a more classic feel to me overall. I'd also argue that the metal that's used on this device just makes it feel a bit more premium because of that additional heft. Now, it makes it heavier and probably not so great in long-term game sessions, but I do like that trade-off of having something that feels really nice and premium. Now, the Retroid Pocket 5 and Mini are relatively similar in that they both have full glass fronts. You can see all the way across here. It does have this kind of unique and somewhat premium feel too. Now, the backs on these are plastic and they have kind of just a cheaper feeling compared to metal, but still feel very good. These two devices also have some nice ergonomic bumps to them, which make them feel really nice and comfortable. They just kind of cup around in your hand. The Retroid Pocket Mini in particular is really impressive because, those little ergonomic bumps make this feel a lot more comfortable and compact than you may think, even though it is a bit thicker. So I would say these two devices still have a premium sort of feel to them, but they are different than like a metal handheld. They just have this all glass front, which feels kind of nice on the hands. The flip is a totally different experience. This thing is a bit more flat, as you can see here, although it is thicker in this part as opposed to here on the bottom. And so it feels more like, holding an old school Nintendo DS or maybe even a 3DS. I would say in terms of just overall comfort, this one's probably my least favorite among the four, but I still think it's good. Like, I've got no major complaints about the feel other than it just doesn't feel quite as ergonomic as the others. And among the four, this one's the one that I like to use with more modern games because of that analog stick placement. It's just a better fit overall. So I do like the kind of versatility we have with this particular layout. So again, I wouldn't say that any of these are better than the others, just whether or not one is going to be a better fit. This one definitely feels more classically premium to me, whereas these have a more modern aesthetic to it because of like the updated D-pad with dome switches and that glass front as well. And the Flip 2 kind of scratches its own itch by having that clamshell form factor. Okay, now let's briefly talk about these screens because there is kind of a wide range, at least between the Retroids and the Anbernic. Like I mentioned already, these three are OLED, and I think it's pretty obvious here compared to the LCD. You can see that, like the blue horizon here is a lot more color saturated compared to the LCD. Same thing with like the red car. In general, the contrast ratio is one of the more exciting things about an OLED display. For example, with the Road, you can see it's somewhat gray here on the LCD panel compared to black on the other ones. And so those are those kind of little things that make it just pop a little bit more when playing on an OLED display. So yes, it is very impressive. I would say in terms of color, the Retroid devices are all pretty much tuned in with each other, but then the Anbernic one is a little bit cooler. You can see that with the red here on the car. Now, in terms of maximum brightness, these all get very bright, but the Retroids in particular get a little bit brighter. Among them, I would say that the Retroid Pocket 5 and Flip 2 are actually the brightest. They are brighter than the Mini. So if you are looking to play outdoors, then I would say that the 5 and the Flip 2 are probably going to give you the best screen experience, but the Mini is still pretty darn good on its own, and the Anbernic is still a bright display, all things considered. So in the end, I think that yes, the OLED displays do look better in terms of the overall color and the contrast ratio, but I still think the Anbernic looks pretty darn good. The main advantages of this one over the others happens to be this resolution and aspect ratio and refresh rates. Let's talk about that. Now for this section, I'm not going to use the Retroid Pocket Flip 2 because it is the same screen as the Retroid Pocket 5, so everything that I'm going to show here is going to apply to both of those two devices. Let's start by talking about 4x3 content. We'll start with an NES game. So here we are with DuckTales, and this is running in 4x3 with these two devices, and then this one is not, just because there are a lot of different things you can do with this screen that are very unique. I'm not going to go into all the details about it because I talk about it in my review of this device, but for the purposes of this video, I will say that we are using an 8:7 aspect ratio because it's more fitting with this screen in particular, and then I'm using an overscan to basically allow it to fill up the whole display. So when it comes to 4x3 content, this one's a little bit wonky, but we can still kind of move forward from here. The first thing you'll notice is the Anbernic gives us the biggest image altogether when it comes to this 4x3 content. This one obviously fills up the whole screen, which will make it 4.7 inches, whereas on the Retroid Pocket 5 with its 5.5 inch display that's 16:9, this is going to be 4.5 inches, so not that much smaller, but still it is. The Retroid Pocket Mini is obviously unique, but it's filling up the whole screen, which means it's going to be 3.92 inches, so still smaller than the other two. So when it comes to 4x3 content, which includes, all the old school stuff, you can play Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Genesis, and so on, Dreamcast, Nintendo 64, PS1, PS2, GameCube, all that stuff's going to be bigger on the Anbernic than it is any of the other Retroids. The main advantage of the RP5 is that you can use things like widescreen hacks on 3D based systems. Dreamcast, Nintendo 64, PS2, and GameCube, many of these games will support it, and so you can fill out the entire screen right here. It's still image-wise going to be smaller than a 4x3 on the Anbernic, but it's still going to look really good. Likewise, when it comes to playing 16:9 content, then the Retroid Pocket 5 is going to be a better fit. This is going to be 5.5 inches because it takes up the whole screen, whereas on the Anbernic it's going to be 4.3 inches when showing 16:9 content. And then of course the Retroid Pocket Mini with its squarish display is going to have a lot of letterboxing, so this will only be 3.4 inches. I think this is too small. So when it comes to 16:9 content, you can kind of get away with it on the Anbernic, but something like the Retroid Pocket 5 or the Flip 2 is just going to be a much better fit. So if we're talking about all-around functionality between 4x3 and 16:9, I would say the Retroid Pocket 5 is a better fit because obviously you can play 16:9 stuff in full screen, and then the 4x3 stuff is still a pretty good size, 4.5 inches. When you combine that with the ability to use widescreen hacks and cheats with a 16:9 system like this one, then this just gives you a lot more options. However, if we're just talking about 4x3 content, I feel like the Anbernic is going to win out in that regard just because it is a natural fit, and there's something magical about playing a game that's designed to be played on a screen that already fits it. So when it comes down to it, like with the rest of this video, it's all very subjective and it depends on what you actually want. But when it comes to a screen that's going to fit your needs, I think that for all-around gaming, the Retroid Pocket 5 and Flip 2 are the best fit just because it does pretty good with everything. If you're looking for just 4x3 content, then I think the Anbernic is very good. And then when it comes to the Retroid Pocket Mini, it also does 4x3 well, but you usually will have to stretch it out to 8x7. But this one really shines when it comes to like Game Boy and Game Boy Color because those benefit from a more square screen. Now, there are two other major benefits to the RG477M when it comes to the refresh rate, because this one is 120 Hertz. A while back, I made a video talking about black frame insertion and the CRT beam simulator shader. And these are two tools that you can apply within RetroArch to enhance the motion clarity when you're playing, and they require a 120 Hertz display. I'm going to link to that video down below, but long story short, if you are looking to have something that has a more CRT-like effect and better motion clarity, then the Anbernic is going to give you that over the Retroid devices by virtue of it having a higher refresh rate. Another benefit of a high refresh rate screen is that it can minimize input latency, which is really important when it comes to emulation, especially on a dedicated handheld like these. So I did a quick input latency test among the 4 different options, and what I did is I used my phone, which can do 1080p and 240 frames per second recording. From there, I recorded myself pressing the jump button in Mega Man 2 a bunch of times. I then exported out these videos, then slowed them way down and counted them frame by frame. And in doing so, I counted 15 frames from the moment I pressed the button down all the way until the character actually jumped. And that's going to give you 62.5 milliseconds of input latency. On the Retroid Pocket Flip 2, as well as the Retroid Pocket Mini, I got the same average, which was 23 frames. Now, sometimes I'd get 22, sometimes it'd be 24, but the average was 23, which is 95.83 milliseconds. The Retroid Pocket 5 was just barely behind it, with 24 frames of delay, or 100 milliseconds. So among the 4, you can see the Anbernic is quite a bit faster, about 2/3 the input latency as the others. And for reference, I found a Reddit post where somebody had timed the input latency on a Super Nintendo as well as in emulation a bunch of times. There's a lot to unpack here, but the main point is that an original Super Nintendo console on a CRT television with a wired controller gave this person 50 milliseconds of delay. And then, of course, depending on what platform they were using, whether or not they were using Run Ahead, and then also additional tools, they got all the way to 133 milliseconds just via HDMI on RetroArch. So when it comes down to it, none of these have the same input latency as actually using original hardware, but the Anbernic is the closest. And so if that's important to you, the 120 Hz refresh rate does make a difference compared to the Retroid models. So as you're probably figuring out by now, it's not really a clear-cut winner or loser situation. It really depends on what you're looking for. If you are prioritizing 4x3 gaming with a more classic setup and you want to have the lowest input latency possible without using things like Run Ahead, then yes, a 120 Hz display like on this Anbernic is going to be the best fit. Along those same lines, if you're looking for something a bit more well-rounded, like for example playing PSP or Nintendo Switch on a 16:9 display, then obviously the Retroid Pocket 5 is going to be a better fit in that regard. Okay, moving on from screen, let's talk about audio. I'm going to test the same game, Castlevania 2 Belmont's Revenge on the Game Boy, among the 4 different options at around the same volume, so you can get an idea of how these each sound. At first, I'm just going to play them so you can hear the differences between them and make your own judgments, and then I'll play them again with my own notes. So among the 4, I would not say the audio is amazing, and they each have their own characteristics, but I found the Retroid Pocket Flip 2 had the most balance. The Anbernic still sounds good, but it lacks bass, and the other 2 kind of try to compensate with additional bass, but it messes up the mids and highs. Now, each of these devices have active cooling fans, and that can come into play when it comes to high-end emulation, just because it's going to push the CPU a little bit more, and that active cooling will cool everything off. And the thing about that is that it can get quite loud, and the audio profile of that can also be a big deal. So here, let's compare the full fan volume with the Anbernic as well as the Retroid Pocket 5. Between the two, I would say that the Anbernic has a bit of a coil whine, which does not sound pleasant to my ears, but they are all equally loud when it comes to max volume. The bigger issue among them is that it's kind of rare that you have to push the fan all the way to the max on the Retroid, but with the Anbernic it does come on more often and it is louder. So in general, if you don't like hearing fan noise while playing a device, the Anbernic is going to be the worst among them. So now briefly, we're going to talk about CPU and performance, and this can be a little bit tricky because in terms of raw performance metrics, the Anbernic is a lot more powerful, but when it comes to actual gameplay, the results are somewhat mixed. I did two particular benchmarks that I want to discuss. The first is the standard wildlife test within 3D Mark, and then I also did the wildlife extreme test. So I was kind of doing like a mid-range test and then a high-end one. For the mid-range test, what I did here is I turned it to the lowest power profile on each of these handhelds. Essentially, I was trying to see how much it would perform at that lowest tier. And here are the scores for that one. The Anbernic had a score of 8589, while the other three had a similar score, which makes sense because they have the same chipset, of around 4700. So the Anbernic is getting nearly double the performance at the lowest power profile setting compared to the others. And it's a similar story with the Wildlife Extreme test, which is a more demanding test. And this one I did at the full throttle, like putting it at the highest performance mode, turning the fan on the max. And you can see here the score in the Anbernic was 2411, whereas the others were around 1300 altogether. So again, in terms of raw performance power, the Anbernic is nearly twice as powerful as the others. So let's put that performance into context, and what this essentially means in terms of emulation is that everything up through like PlayStation Portable will be able to play on any of these devices upscaled to match the resolution of the screen. So when it comes to like PlayStation Portable, for example, you can play them at a 4x resolution on the Retroid Pocket 5, which is going to be 1080p, and it's going to work great. Another example would be playing upscale Dreamcast to a 960p resolution, which you would be able to do on the Anbernic no problem whatsoever. Where the rubber meets the road is going to be GameCube and PlayStation 2, and this is where the raw performance power of that Anbernic actually does come into play, because I would rather play on the Anbernic with those particular systems than the Retroid Pocket 5, with a caveat. I talked about this a lot in my Anbernic RG477M review earlier this week, but this thing just feels like it's made to play GameCube and PS2. As an example, I'm playing Jak 3 here, one of the harder games to play on the PS2, and I'm playing it in fast forward mode to basically push it as far as I can. And on average, this thing is running at about 150 to 160% speed, which means that we have a bunch of headroom to work with. If we just play this normally, that means that we are probably not going to encounter that many slowdowns. Now on the Retroid Pocket 5, it's not quite as performant. I'm also playing this one at a 2x resolution upscale, and it is struggling to keep up. There are moments when it will fast forward up to like 140, 150%, but a lot of other times it'll drop down to 100%, so it'll just be at the normal speed, or it'll even dip down a little bit as well. Not only that, compatibility issues with this chipset prevent it from actually printing the screen correctly. So for example, with Daxter's eyes, they're just these black holes. You have to go into these settings, mess around with it, and try to get it to be fixed. On the Anbernic, I didn't have any of those issues. The emulation accuracy was actually better. Now the main caveat here is that the Retroid Pocket 5 can play it in widescreen, which is something you can't do in the RG477M, and I think it looks awesome. And in the end, I would still say the Retroid Pocket 5 is very capable of playing PlayStation 2 games. It may require you to go into the settings and fiddle around a little bit more, but most games are going to be playable. It just so happens the Anbernic has more power to be able to push through and not have to rely on settings configurations, which is my own preference when it comes to emulating these high-end systems. I want to spend more time in the game than in the menu. And so across the board, when emulating PlayStation 2 and GameCube, they are still very capable handhelds in both regards, but with the Anbernic, it's a little bit more natural and seamless because it's kind of plug and play. On the Retroid Pocket devices, you're going to be spending more time in the menus, but once you got them configured and you can actually play them correctly, then it can be a really great time because you can do things like widescreen hex on the RP5 and Flip 2, and then also you'll be playing these games on an OLED display, which I think does look better than on an LCD. I kind of think of it like the Anbernic is a safety net that allows me to play more games with fewer issues because we have all that performance power. One last example here is going to be F-Zero GX. Now, this game runs fine on both of these devices at a 2x resolution, but with the Anbernic, it is a little bit smoother. If you look at the top right on this HUD, you can see that there's a max value, and that essentially is going to be the fastest the game would emulate if you took off the fact that it was running at 100% speed. And on the Retroid Pocket 5, it's running around 200 to 220%. Meanwhile, on the Anbernic, it's an average about 320%, which means that you have that much more headroom, which means that you're going to be less likely to encounter stutters and slowdown. So long story short, I would rather play GameCube and PlayStation 2 on the Anbernic, and that's because, playing these games in 4x3 is a very fitting thing for me. It's very nostalgic, but then also I just have fewer headaches. I don't have to go into the menu as much. It's more plug and play, and that's exactly where I want to be when it comes to playing these games. One other factor to consider with PlayStation 2 and GameCube is the overall control scheme and which one's going to be better for you. And I would say for those two systems, the Retroid actually feels a little bit better because we have stacked shoulders and triggers, and the triggers are also an analog input, which is pretty important when it comes to GameCube. So what I do for GameCube on the Anbernic is I set the analog input to the shoulder button and then the full button pressed to the trigger button. That means if I'm playing something like Super Mario Sunshine, I can press this button and run around and squirt the water, but then I also can press this one to stay in place and squirt as well. It's a little bit less intuitive than using a true analog input like on the Retroid Pocket devices, but it still works for me. Now, when it comes to everything beyond PlayStation 2 and GameCube, I greatly prefer playing on the Retroid Pocket 5 and Flip 2. And a lot of this comes down to the Adreno 650 GPU found in the Snapdragon 865, which just gives us better compatibility with some of those high-end emulators. And Nintendo Switch is the easiest example because many of these games will simply not run on the Anbernic when they run perfectly fine on the Retroid Pocket 5. Now, Switch emulation is always a moving target between all of the different GPU drivers that you can enable on the Retroid side, and then also the various Yuzu forks that you can play as well on Android. But at least in this example, when I'm using the Eden emulator between all of these, you can see that these are games in particular that are problematic on the Anbernic. They will completely crash and not play, whereas they'll be just fine on the Retroid Pocket 5 and Flip 2. Not only that, once a game actually does start playing, it's going to be a better fit anyway because it's a 16:9 aspect ratio. We've got those stacked triggers and shoulders, and so this is just a better way to play Nintendo Switch and other systems like it. Things like Wii U and PS Vita. I would play all those on the Retroid Pocket 5 more than the Anbernic. Now, none of these systems are perfect with either of these devices because the chipset isn't quite as powerful, but still, something to be mindful of is that you will have a better time with the Retroid Pocket 5 on those high-end systems than the Anbernic. Even when you get a game to run on the Anbernic, it's still going to be a bit more slow than the other one. And so loading screens, things like that, are going to take longer compared to the Retroid Pocket 5. So in general, yes, playing Nintendo Switch games, I'd rather do it on the top device. And so once again, it really comes down to what you prioritize. If you want to play some of these 16:9 higher end emulation games, then absolutely the Retroid Pocket devices are going to be a better fit, both in terms of compatibility, but then also just the button layout as well as the screen. The same could be said for playing Android games as well as game streaming. Now, because the Retroid Pocket 5 is a D-pad centered device, I would rather use a grip case with it just to improve the ergonomics, but at that point, yeah, it's perfectly playable. So if you are looking to do, either local game streaming or over the cloud with Xbox gaming, you can do all that stuff on the Retroid Pocket 5, and it just feels a little bit more natural just because we have that 16:9 aspect ratio, and again, those stacked shoulders and triggers. To top it off, there are some compatibility issues with the Anbernic side compared to Retroid, so some games as well as streaming apps will not actually register your inputs. In my review, I showed off that NVIDIA GeForce Now app doesn't work at all, and same thing with Diablo Immortal, even though this one plays perfectly fine on the Retroid Pocket 5. Now, most of these Android games are going to play perfectly fine. I'm specifically showing problematic games to show the difference between the two. And so my overall point here is that yes, you can stream and play Android games on both of these devices, but I would prefer to do it on the Retroid Pocket 5 for all the reasons we've been talking about. Now, one final neat trick that the Retroid devices can do that the Anbernic cannot is that they can boot into Linux. There's a specific Linux distribution called Rocknix that is made for retro game emulation and running PC ports, and this will work with the Snapdragon 865. I've made some videos already talking about Rocknix running on some of these Android-based handhelds, and yeah, this is another world of possibilities that you can do on the Retroid devices that you cannot on the Anbernics. When it comes down to it, a lot of the same games can be played on both Android and Linux, but there are some exceptions. For example, this one can play Xbox, like the original Xbox, although the chipset is not quite up to snuff, so it's not really worth it. A big draw for me is the ability to run PC ports using a tool called Portmaster, which will run on Rocknix and not on Android. I've also made a video about Portmaster. I will leave it linked down below if you haven't heard of it, but essentially essentially they have over 1,100 ports that you can play right now. They keep adding more and more, and I'm kind of overdue in making an update video to show just how many awesome ones have been added recently. But yes, some old favorites will be there, and if you sort it by the most popular ports, you can see there's just a treasure trove of games that you can play. And so this also expands the usability of the Retroid Pocket devices compared to the Anbernic, if these are systems and games that you want to play. And one last point is going to be battery life, and it's relatively similar among all these four handhelds, so let's look at the results I had from my recent RG477M review. When it comes to the low-end stuff, like your retro gaming, I would expect somewhere between like 8 and 12 hours of gameplay, depending on your settings and your shaders and your refresh rate and all that kind of stuff, but that's usually what you can expect. When it comes to the higher end stuff, GameCube and PS2, in general, I would say somewhere between like 3 and 6 or 7 hours is probably going to be a pretty good middle ground. Again, there's a lot of variety here in terms of how demanding each of these games are going to be within their particular systems, but in general, that's what I would expect among all four of these handhelds. And then finally, on the high-end side, if you're playing things like Nintendo Switch or trying to emulate Windows, that stuff's going to give you about 2.5 hours of battery life across all these different platforms. The size of the battery in each of these devices is relatively similar, around 4,000 to 5,000 milliamp hours, and so that's why the results are also pretty similar. Okay, so putting this all together, usually when I do a comparison video, I'll have like a table and I'll show all these different grades and different numbers and assign these points, but I don't think that's a really good fit for this particular video because these four devices are wildly different. It really does come down to what type of game you plan on playing and what kind of form factor is the most important for you. If you want a really small and compact handheld with an OLED display that can play things like Game Boy really nicely, but still does a good job with 4x3 content, then obviously the Retroid Pocket Mini is a really great example. Same thing when it comes to more modern systems and games. Anything that's a 16:9 aspect ratio, things like game streaming as well, I would rather play them on the Retroid Pocket 5 or the Flip 2, and the separation between the two is really going to come down to form factor. But if you are going to focus on more retro systems, all the way up to PS2 and GameCube, then I feel like there are a lot of benefits to using the Anbernic RG477M. This one is the most expensive. It's $20 more than the Retroid Pocket Flip 2. But I think if you're really focusing on retro gaming in particular, it's still an excellent fit and one of the best handhelds that Anbernic has ever made. Now, if I had to pick just one of these to keep for myself, I don't know. I've been thinking about it a lot over this past week, and I'm still really torn about it. When it comes to traveling around and having something really compact to be able to just whip out and play, then I think the RP Mini is the best fit in that regard, and the proof is in the pudding because I've taken this on several trips this year. When it comes to just overall all-around gaming and just kind of having it in multiple use cases, then the Retroid Pocket Flip 2 I think would probably be my overall choice just because it's got that clamshell form factor which makes it, protects the screen and all the other things that I love about a clamshell. So this kind of is my overall pick. But I think if we're just talking about retro games and, playing them in the most optimized way possible, then I think the Anbernic really has a shot as well because of that 4:3 aspect ratio, the 120 Hz refresh rate, which reduces input latency and allows us to use other motion clarity effects. I don't know, there's a lot to love about this one as well. I think if this handheld was made out of plastic, it would be a bit more of a clear winner because I do prefer plastic handhelds over metal, but I can't fault the fact that it feels really premium as well. So at the end of the day, like with many Retro Game Core videos, I don't have a simple solution for you. It really comes down to you putting on your own thinking cap and figuring out which one is the best fit for you. And I hope that throughout this very long video, I've given you all the tools to help you make that decision. At the end of the day, it's just super awesome that we have 4 excellent handhelds in a similar price point to choose from. I mean, a few years ago, we did not have options like this on the market. So overall, I think it's a pretty cool place to be. Let me know what you think in the comments down below, and as always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.